Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring a question we all have to grapple with. How do we prioritise risks? Whether that's in a personal capacity or a work context, we've all got to make decisions about where we deploy limited resources, most obviously time and money, but also things like headspace, to make things safer or more resilient. My guest, Magda Osman, is a psychologist by training. She's also a professor of basic and applied decision-making at Leeds Business School. Magda's specific interest is in decision-making under risk and uncertainty, and she works with governments and companies to help them look at these issues. What I really value about Magda is that she's up for challenging orthodoxy and presenting new ways of looking at the world. If you've heard her before, and if you haven't, there are links in the show notes to those episodes, you'll know the conversation can often venture into unexpected places. But that's exactly what this show is all about. So you'll hear about risk prioritization, group wisdom, the risks of consensus, how social dynamics influence decision-making, the power of cognitive diversity, and much, much more. I've never had a conversation with Magda that hasn't made me think, and I hope she has the same effect on you. So here is my discussion with Magda Osman on risk prioritization. Magda, welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast.
Hello.
As the shortest and sweetest thing. But to be honest, you've done that response on a number of occasions because this is I'm not even going to count them. You've been back so many times. Such a pleasure to have you back. Friend of the show. What have you been doing since we last spoke?
Well, I have been doing quite a lot, but
Absolutely nothing, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. I've done nothing at all other than waiting to go back on this podcast. So the often I've talked about on this podcast are the things that aren't necessarily explicitly talking about risk, but they are sort of nominally related to it, risk. But so a lot of the work most recently that I've been doing seems to reflect certain patterns of interests that different organizations have around risk and particularly risk prioritization. So I thought, why not talk about that with you, and hopefully it would be of interest to your listeners.
Brilliant. Well, let's find out on both counts. But so risk prioritization. So this, if you give me those words, I would start assuming this is about saying we face lots of risks. We'll have to prioritize on some level, whether we want to or not. And we can think about that in our personal sphere, I guess, in terms of which things we think are important, but we can think in a corporate sphere as well. And so I presume this is all about saying which things do we care about more than others, and therefore what drives our expenditure and behaviors.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So to get the sort of basic details right, when we're thinking about risk, essentially what we're worrying about is what are the things that are going to cause problems, so the hazards. What are those problems actually going to be, the harms, and what's the scale or severity of those harms? Right? So that's in a typical sense what we're talking about in the risk sphere. But you're right in that we do this intuitively on a daily basis. So this has consequences for us personally, but also there are a number of organizations, private and public, that have to, because of resource issues, so this is fundamentally a risk management type theme, is how do we sensibly figure out, given the resources we have, what things we need to target? Because there's always going to be ongoing problems or ongoing risks, but there are some that will require immediate attention. Others are just kind of chronic and ongoing. So how do we figure out for any particular period what to target and how to target that? So that's kind of the reason why it's worth talking about is that, as I said, there's a kind of recurring theme because I'm getting asked quite often now from different organizations, how do we do this? So how do we do this in a way that is actually a repeatable, transparent process? So I can split this kind of various elements of this into, let's say, 3 parts where we can explore some of the kind of complexities and how they can be resolved.
I think this is really, really interesting because what you're exposing here, or helping to solve, not just exposing, is really a challenge, as you say, that everybody faces. But we're often not honest about it, in part because it's really hard. And if I compared it to, let's look at advertising. Companies you'll go, well, we spend this much on this, right? And we know that that's going to be successful, and therefore it makes sense. And we can kind of rationalize it. And we can, yes, we experiment a little bit, but that's much harder with risk. You may not even know that you've got it right. It's easy to detect when you've mismanaged it and you failed to spot something. COVID would be an interesting example of that in many cases. And so I love the fact that you, as is typical with your research, you've kind of just gone, this is complicated, difficult, hence people come to you, and you've just gone, let's have a look at it. So talk us through a little bit more around that. I definitely think is interesting, but I can see why we have a human tendency towards shying away from it.
Yes. Yeah. Because you can see in the different illustrations that I'll give why it actually confronts some kind of core things about our psychology. So let's structure it. So the first thing is, who's doing the risk prioritization and for who, on whose behalf? Right, so that's one. And then the second is what's typically done. And then the third is, how do you come up with different methodologies and approaches to actually resolve some of these issues? So if we look at the who bit, then there are a number of organizations that will have expert risk managers. We can use the word expert loosely here or very rigorously, however you conceive. Now, often you go, right, okay, for this quarter or for this year, we need to think about how we're going to address the different risks that are going to come up. And there can be risks to the organization. So this could be internally facing. So what are we going to do in terms of, well, the market is very hostile or very unstable. So that's going to put some strains on selling a particular product or service. So we might have to think about scaling the workforce or a whole load of other things, right? So, and then other shocks that might be hard to estimate the likelihood for, right? So the risk managers are essentially making decisions on behalf of, in this case, their employees. But if you're in a public sector organization, you're thinking on behalf of the public, right? So you go, well, these are 5 or 30 things that are likely to appear in the year. We have to basically attach nominally some probability of these things happening, also determine the scale, but we're actually having to think in terms of the harms to the public. Right? So that's why I said, who's making the kind of prioritizations for who is critical here, because research in the judgment decision-making domain in psychology primarily, but other disciplines also, there's a long, long history of work that tells you about risk perceptions and the differences between what experts perceive as risks for various things, and then how an unfortunate term, non-experts perceive the risks of the same things. Right? So there's kind of deviation. So you can map these things out. You go, all right, in this sort of region, all of these things are perceived as high risk, but they're very different depending on whether you're sampling an expert or a non-expert. So that's one. And then the other thing, and I'll stop for a moment, is what's referred to as the risk paradox, which is if you ask people, well, here's 8 things, just tell me how risky each one of these things are. And you go, right, okay, well, for these 2, these are the top things that people think are really risky. Could be anything, like could be something that's in the home or with the way you travel to, whether nuclear energy, it could be anything, like you just throw stuff at people. You go, right, okay, well, then we want to look at how people behave in relation to those things. And the risk paradox is that even if you perceive these things as very risky, it doesn't have a direct effect on behavior. Like, so people still behave around these things, even though they know them to be risky, or in reverse, right? So this is where you actually see a complete misalignment Now, you can solve that 'cause you can find ways to actually predict behavior, but it's not exclusively just risk perception.
So you've just basically made it more complex, right? Because we started out with the whole, none of this is easy. It's not always visible. You don't always know you've succeeded, but it's really important and it's very expensive. So the fundamental dynamics are challenging. And then you've just added that extra layer of, and I'll be really loose in my language here. We're a bit crap at that as well, right? We delude ourselves around it. We're not very good at this stuff. And so that really, in a nutshell, is why this is challenging, right? It's a difficult subject, and and you think as a species, we're pretty good at it, right? But that's more of a diversification play, I guess. When I look at us as individuals and as groups as individuals, we're not necessarily very good at this at all.
Well, I'm kind of on human side here rather than treating people as not rational or good or any of that kind of stuff. But to qualify what I mean here is a risk manager's decision on how to mitigate risk has to take into account the public, at least in some cases, the public understanding of the risks. So how they understand it and what experiences they have are going to be different. So you go, well, actually, the risks are very low, but we have to respond to concerns from the public, in which case we put out a public campaign or we recall various products because there's just not going to be an appetite for it. Whatever other stuff, like in the corporate or in the private sector, things are done to adjust for an actual understanding by people. Now, that doesn't mean to say that what people are thinking is nonsense. It's just that how they understand it is based on different sources of knowledge, right? So there's asymmetries there. Now, if you just said, well, if we're just looking at risk perceptions, then you're asking people, how risky do you think this thing is? How catastrophic? What do you know about it? And so on, which all goes into the risk perceptions kind of metric. But actually, to make this sensible, so you can actually see what is predictive of what, you ask people, what are you tolerating in terms of risk? Right. So that's very different. And that's actually much closer to what is generally going on in terms of calculation. So you go, well, what are the costs you think they're associated, in which case risk is also in there, right? You might be exposed to some degree of harm. So I know that, but the utility associated with this thing is too high for me not to use it, be it a service, a product, or whatever it is. So here's a way to think about this in terms of a kind of tangible example, right? So you've got two modes of transport you might be considering at one time, right? So you've got to rush to meet a relative or whoever. The weather conditions are really awful. So you could drive or you could take the train. But let's imagine currently the circumstances are that you've no idea whether there's actually going to be rail strike that day as well, right? So you have to factor these things in. So you go, well, I might say that taking the train's probably better, it's less risky and all of that kind of stuff. I'm exposing more risk by taking the car because the icy weather conditions and so on. So if you just looked at the perceptions, that wouldn't be enough. But if you said, well, what's the trade-offs that you're making? Right. So I need to actually make sure that I get there. So I think I'm going to get there. There's more likely I get there if I take the car than if I take the train, because I don't know all of the other stuff. Right. So there's too many uncertainty. I just have to be that much more vigilant. I'm in control because I'm driving. So I know to be that much more careful because of the weather conditions and so on. At least I know that I'm going to get there, but it's going to be right. So that's risk tolerance. Right. So you're doing the calculation going, right, given the benefits I see relative to the cost, I know I'm going to adjust my actions accordingly. Right. So that's actually closer to predicting behavior than just risk perceptions alone. Right. So that's a solvable issue. Right. So it's complicated, but there are ways to make it work so it doesn't seem so impossible.
Okay. But that's only part of the equation, right? Obviously.
Yeah, yeah. So
I was about to jump in with what I thought might else be in there, but let me let you continue, and
no.
Because my initial reaction was one of the things as I was thinking about that hypothetical decision. One of the factors that immediately comes to play is I'm probably going somewhere to meet someone else or to do something, there's a time element to it. And so I need to also think about what story am I going to tell them if it goes wrong, right? Because I want to avoid embarrassment to myself. And so you might say the car is great because I'm in control and whisper, I can probably drive a bit faster if I need to, and I can all those kinds of things. Whereas if I'm sitting on a train, there's nothing I can do. But if the train's delayed, that's a much better story than actually what might happen in terms of if I get delayed in traffic, because people will kind of go, well, you should have left earlier. Whereas with the train, somebody else has made the decision as to what time you should leave. And so that from a defensive decision-making perspective, that's much safer. So thinking not just about our own perception, where my brain was going was, I have to think about what this, if it's all fine, nobody will ever know, right? Maybe they'll think I'm a hero for making it through the weather. But if it goes wrong, I've got to not just think about my own perception, but I've got to think about other people's perception. And so that might skew entirely how I decide.
Well, now we're into the territory of rationalizations and accountability. So that's different. So but what I said stands with respect to what predicts behavior, either sort of risk perceptions alone, so not so much, and risk tolerance, which does a lot more. And actually, the work on that is an emerging area of research, right? So there's not actually, aside from the risk tolerance in financial domain, outside of that, there's not that much that's done. It's only just starting out, but it's very promising. So anyway, when you're thinking about how you are going to make an argument or be accountable for decisions that you made, then that's different, right? So that's actually the second element. So how people make decisions, or what's the process that goes into risk prioritization? Because this is where all of the practical stuff kicks in. So you're saying, well, as a risk manager, a group of people, invariably these things are not done individually. They're done in groups, certainly in organizational level, public and private. So then you're
And
then
actually,
you're
I think it's
exposed
interesting because even personal decisions, I would argue, we think we're making decisions on our own, but actually there will probably be other people that we will consult on some level that will bring into that particular process. So as you were talking, I was thinking, well, okay, the decision about which journey I take is a decision I make on my own, ultimately. If I'm to assume I'm traveling on my own. But actually, maybe I'll talk to my partner about it and get their views. Maybe I'll talk to someone that's done that journey recently in these weather conditions. I probably am going to talk to at some point, particularly if the weather's noticeable, right? I.e., the decision's salient because I'm having to make choices that I might not have to make otherwise. Maybe I'm going to talk to the people I'm meeting as well and involve them in the process. So I think it's really interesting when we think about decisions we make on our own. Yeah, of course we do. If I'm standing there in a supermarket on my own, some level I'm making a decision. But actually, when it comes to these risk-based things, we are, even if we think we're making it on our own, we're probably tapping into collective wisdom. And that might be on the internet, people we've never met before, or it might be people we speak to. So for me, there's not that much of a difference between individual decision-making and corporate decision-making, albeit the corporate ones tend to be more formalized structured. You can see the other people more obviously.
Yes, there are some sort of critical differences, maybe sort of in magnitude than kind, if you think in terms of the how you're coordinating among groups for the decision you're making personally. Right, so you're right. Most things that you're not doing in isolation of others. I mean, unless you're living as a hermit in Scotland somewhere. Yeah, and I like Scotland. So I'm not damning Scotland. I heart Scotland. But anyway, so you could try to reverse engineer what I'm saying at a personal level, but let's focus this in terms of organization. So you have a team of people who will get together to have to reach some form of consensus. Now, there are a number of ways in which that can be done. Some people might know about the kind of Delphi method, which is you get sort of a group of experts or different combinations of expertise into a room and then hash things out, which can also be problematic. You get a bunch of academics together to try and agree on something. Yeah, you might have to wait several years for that. Anyway, so often what happens is that you're now exposed to a lot of work or examples of work that's illustrated in kind of social psychology, which is the kind of group dynamic, social dynamic kind of stuff. So, for instance, you have very domineering personalities that will push a particular agenda. So everyone might be going, well, no, actually, I don't think that should be as high in the priority than you're saying. And then you're kind of shot down because, then there's hierarchies, all of those kinds of things. Then there's also the stuff to do with polarization. Now, polarization means something very specific in the group decision-making literature, which is if you ask people to start with in terms of where they're at for some particular thing, you go, well, always tilting in this particular direction. And then what happens is the group dynamics push that tilt even further along. Right? So that's polarization, actually, in the technical sense. What we tend to think of polarization in the normal lay sense, like so in the usual colloquial discussion, is what's known as extremisation. So you're going to extremes. So you start off neutrally, and then the group dynamics just push you at polar ends. In any case, all of that kind of stuff is just right in a group decision-making process anyway, and no less consequential when you're thinking about how to prioritize things and then add resources to that. So often what happens, that there are technical consequences also when you're in the risk prioritization kind of domain, because what things I care about to help prioritize the risks will be entirely different from yours, right? So the criteria that I use might be different, right? So how are you going to have a meaningful exchange to get a consensus if they're all over the shop?
So an example might be, I don't know, you've been through an experience. Let's imagine even if we had similar sort of I can see if we had different priorities, but even if you had similar sorts of priorities, you might have been through an experience where, I don't know, reputational risk was really significant. And therefore that is going to weigh heavily on you in a way that somebody who, even if they've had a similar experience, doesn't. So we can see that the approach that we'd have to that process would be influenced heavily by those experiences. So we're not all, even with the same sorts of experience, even similar sort of backgrounds, we can still bring separate perspectives to the table.
Yeah. But let's say there's there's 3 different technologies that we might consider as things that we might worry about. That it could be around sort of machine learning or large language models or whatever, something fancy like that. We have to figure out which one of, let's say, different tools associated with those technologies we might use, because we want to buy them. We can't buy all of them. We need to buy one. But we're going to have to prioritize what also the risks are associated with each one of them to then make a decision about it. So you go, well, I've already used some of them. I like them. And I don't use any of them, but I've looked at all of the literature on them, right? So how do we square that, right? Because you might be, in terms of personal experience, have lots of useful things to say, but I need to coordinate that with what I've seen in terms of evidence, right? Because I might care more about the evidence than you do. So anyway, you can see the criteria. We might have the same criteria, but weight them differently to be able to then, right? So that has an impact on me because I'm going to weight things differently in terms of criteria to make the decision as to how to prioritize stuff. So that's a matter for me personally or in my personal life. But if I'm coordinating with other people, then I need to know what the criteria you are using. And then we have to find a way to change the weighting so that we can take all of these things into account. Right? So that's the difficulty there, is people don't want to talk about that. But what they'll say is, yeah, but I know because I've read article on this. You go, no, you don't know anything about this because, I've had very personal experience. Or I know that my competitor has been using this kind of stuff for so we need to be right, and whatever other thing. And then what happens is people justify decisions on gut feeling, and that's not good.
Well, no, I mean, you could challenge that slightly though, because I think sometimes if you look at good decisions that have been made, there is an element of gut instinct that's kicked in that possibly we can't always explain. And so I take the point entirely that if people are just running on gut instinct, right, that it might be appallingly wrong. But part of the reason we rely on it is that there is some validity on some level to it. And we can, you might argue, get lucky with that, but it can also work. So I agree with you. My start point is, but I'm increasingly of the view that we also need to recognize there are certain things that can't easily be quantified or justified or explained that are still valid. But that's hard. Boredom in it won't look particularly good, I'll put it that way, if you just say, well, yeah, we kind of thought this felt like the right thing to do, right? That doesn't work particularly well if you're under scrutiny.
I mean, but if you're accountable to your shareholders or if you're accountable to the public and you already know, right? So then this isn't done in good faith because you already know that a final decision that was made as to why you would focus on this risk against these other 8 things that are on your radar is based on, I felt it was good to do that. Right. So especially if it's attached with sort of millions or billions of pounds worth of shares or money or dividends or, or public expenditure or so on. Right. So that's just simply not good enough. Right. So I'm not denying the validity of the one's intuitions or what is loaded in what is meant by intuition or gut, right? Because that's just in some ways a way it's a shorthand for saying prior experiences or the features that sort of seem salient to you that you're going to go, yeah, I kind of think that. But you need to kind of inspect that because that has to be an accountable decision, right? So that's all I'm saying. So that's not good enough if you're just going, well, my gut told me. Or
A little
I felt
voice
that.
told.
Yeah. It's a yeah. It's like, yeah. Although you probably wouldn't want to say that to anybody. They might think that there might be something wrong and you might need help. So all of that doesn't help if you care about 2 things. If you're a group of risk managers, if you care that you need to make the decisions around what you're prioritizing as risks accountable, then that you need to have a process that is transparent. And then the other thing is, even if you didn't care about that, you might care that you need to do the decision making as a group efficiently. So what can you do to repeat a process and put it in place that it introduces efficiencies in being able to make those decisions, right? But once you do that, you have to accept that you're going to have to structure a number of things and implement them in the same way in order to avoid kind of all of the noise and biases and all of the other stuff that will influence the decisions, not just individually, but at group level.
Yes.
Yeah. So then the things then are interesting is, well, what workout is out there that allows or helps people to structure the processes that go into making a kind of risk management decision of the kind of prioritizations that are required. So there's one thing that we can come back to, which is how do you even get to the point where you think of the things that ought to be the things to prioritize? But that's that's quite big. Let's kind of suspend that for a moment. There are solvable things, might say. There's ways of structuring stuff. And that's come from a number of different literatures. So the management literature, psychology, economics, and so on. So they point to what's referred to as multi-criteria decision making. So I don't know whether you want me to talk around that.
No, give us if it's possible. Give us a quick synopsis of that for people that haven't come across it.
It's just a useful technique, which is the first thing you do is you go into an organization, you go, well, what things do you care about that you think are the most important things to make an evaluation of something? Well, actually, I care about the evidence. I care about whether there's kind of testing, is there A, beta testing or whatever, and the market share, stakeholders and those kinds of things, right? So that you can list all of those things and they're the criteria. You go, right, I'll ask the next person, I'll ask the next person. You go, all right, it turns out that there are consistent criteria that people tend to use to be able to kind of do these prioritizations, but they don't explicitly refer to them each time. It's just that nominally they think of it. But if you go round and survey people and figure that out, you go, right, okay, well, there's at least 5 or 8 things, whatever they are. They are the criteria. Next thing you do is you go, right, which of those are the most important to you? You go, actually, turns out, because then you can weight things, right? You can add the weight. So then you go, right, now here's a tool where basically all you need to do is plug in numbers. And if you plug in those numbers based on the weight, the model or the tool itself does the number crunching. You're just putting in stuff. You go, oh, yeah, I think I'd give that a 2. I'd give that an 8 and so on.
And so you're answering that outside the context of a specific question, obviously, right? This is let's think
Yeah.
about things in isolation. And then when we come along to a specific question or issue, we're not polluting it by thoughts around what we think might be important for that thing, right?
Exactly.
We've almost set the rules down of how we prioritize things before we get to actually having to put it into action, because otherwise we're going to be biased based on the facts of the situation in front of us.
Yeah, exactly. So you go, well, there are 8 things that we tend to typically care about when we're making any kind of evaluation. So when we go into any new situation, we're going to use those same things each time. But we don't have to do very much in terms of thinking, because the tool or whatever that is set. It's set up for us to just kind of plug in the numbers, and then it just kind of helps do the ranking. So you go, all right, well, I've done that for these things that are on my radar as risky things. I've used the tool, and the numbers come out in this way that, let's say, there were 5 things we were contending for this quarter that could be risks that the organization needs to target in some way. And they're now ranked using this tool. If you do that individually, because that's the other thing. So this is where it's gained. You'd have this thing. Oh, great. This is a way to actually try to introduce some kind of objectivity into the process. But how that's gained by organizations is they'll go, well, we've got this tool, but we're not going to do this all individually and then have a group discussion. I think you can see where this is going.
Can't see how this could possibly go wrong, but take us through it. Just
yeah. So then what happens is go, right, we've got this fancy tool. So because we're all time stretched and time poor and all this kind of stuff, we'll get a meeting together. So there's 10 of us in the room. I'll chair that meeting and we'll fill in together that tool. You go, right, so for the first criteria, we're going to give that a 2, aren't we? Yeah, is that right? So there's no possibility for anybody to actually sort of reveal any kind of dissent. So then you think, well, what's the point of having it? It's basically dominated by particular people. It's not always like that. I mean, it's still not good if you're doing this as coordinated, because where there is possibility for diversity in thought, you're eliminating the possibility of that, because people are worried about saying things that, especially if there's time pressures, someone going, hang on a minute. Oh God, there's a drone across the group where we just hoping to finish this in 40 minutes. So to do this sensibly, you have to use a tool like that, or whatever kind of standard set of criteria on your own, and then you bring that to the group. Now, here's another thing which I'm effectively telling you for free. Rather than
it's amazing what you get on this show for absolutely nothing, Magda. Amazing.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm doing it for public good, obviously. Now, there's an interesting question here which we can talk about in terms of what counts as rational, because if you have in any coordination or collaborative or cooperative setup, you might be conscious about time. So you go, right, there's a number of people that it's going to be difficult to kind of reach a consensus. So what we do is only focus on the things that everybody agrees on. I said, now that's efficient in terms of trying to arrive at a consensus. You go, well, we all agree on these sort of three things, these different criteria. So we might as well go with this. And it's very hard for anybody to go, well, no, hang on, because we disagreed on these other things. But then there wasn't any room for that. But the efficient way, at least on one level that might seem rational, is that you only focus on things you agree on as a collective. And so that's the basis on which you make a consensus decision around what to prioritize. If you don't do that, so actually the first thing you should do, and there's a lot of now literature on this, which is great. I mean, great sort of studies, very interesting and complicated studies, but the findings sort of point in the same direction, which is the first thing you do as a group, if you're going to chair this, you're right. Or what things do we agree on? Eliminate that in terms of the focus of the discussion, because the thing that you need to discuss is why it is that we disagree. What are the criteria in which we disagree? So if we go back to the earlier example, you go, right, you have prior experience of whatever this is. I have some knowledge in terms of the evidence base, right? So if we agreed on something else, you'd never be able to say anything about, oh, hang on, I've got prior experience here, which I ought to bring to the table. And I have actual experience in terms of what the literature is saying, right? So the whole point of using these opportunities is to actually understand things that you had you couldn't necessarily know otherwise, right? So you have to bring that to the table. You go, right, now we can make a slightly better decision because we have to take into account all of these things that we disagreed on, but are relevant. We can eliminate some of the other stuff that might be irrelevant, but there is going to be a lot of rich stuff in there, right? So you can very easily organize and structure a group decision-making process, be it around prioritization or anything else for that matter, where you go, right, we'll portion out the bit where we recognize the things that we all agree on, because the things that we disagree on are the things that we need to cover and resolve so that we can make a fair consensus decision, right? And that is basically it. There you go. I've solved everything.
So, okay, let me just, and this is a slightly meta point, right? Let me just play devil's advocate there, because what you said was, well, what we'll do is let's park anything we agree on. Now, you could say that that's quite dangerous, because actually, if you don't discuss things that you agree on, you might actually discover that there are really important things in there that if you had taken the time to talk about them, you would have found out. But if you don't even touch the subject because you think you agree, are you missing a point? And so I was thinking about, if I take like De Bono's 5 hats, for example, one of the ideas there is that somebody you have an artificial construct that promotes debate and discussion with a view to changing people, to get people to really think about subjects and presenting alternative views. If we've already walked into the room and said we're going to not even bother talking about these things because we agree, are we not missing the opportunity for those risks to have a discussion that might, and I recognize that.
So if what you face is a situation where typically what people are only going to focus on to kind of speed up the process to reach a consensus is only the things that people agree on, then that's a consistent problem. Now, the other thing associated with that is we could all agree on the same things, but for entirely different reasons, right? So that's kind of to your point, which actually is useful to discuss. But at a very basic level, if you're only ever focusing on the things that you all agree on, then that's a problem, right? So what I'm suggesting is not that you don't ever talk about it, but if that's dominating all of the discussion, then you're not optimizing the group decision value, but also you're potentially biasing the outcome. And that's the problem. So then you're basically thinking about what the distribution of time is within a group decision-making context where you allow for people to disagree and bring to mind things that actually will be relevant to inform the decision-making process. And also the other thing about that is the diversity of thought thing is a kind of useful thing to think about in this context, because you, you need to create a forum where it's a value to disagree, right? So that, so you're signaling also organizationally that we need this because, and it's not paying lip service, because we can formalize it as part of the group decision making process. So I'm not saying that you just park and ignore. I mean, I was being slightly facetious, but it's how you portion the time effectively within a group dynamic process when you've got risk managers basically having to very quickly decide on some very consequential decisions where the pressure is, right, we have to come to an agreement now, rather than can we spend a portion of that time looking at where we disagree? Because even if we later ignore that, at some point that's going to come back on us. So it was probably best that we actually had identified that and recognized that and just kind of quickly moved on.
And I love the point that you make around what that does for willing to speak up, right? If the construct of the meeting, the backdrop to which it's had is, right, we are going to flesh out things where there's disagreement, then I think that's incredibly powerful. And you're absolutely right, because it's very easy to sort of have a harmonious feeling meeting because, well, we've only tackled the things we agree with and we'll smile nicely around those. And I'll tell you what, if we run out of time, let's not worry about these two. So I completely buy that. And I love this idea of thinking through actually, well, what are human tendencies? Well, answer is we don't particularly enjoy having disagreements or arguments. It feels uncomfortable. Let's avoid it. So let's design, recognizing that we respond to the structures and the environments we're in. I love that idea of let's create a structure that deliberately focuses on tension, right? It's pulling out. It's the opposite in a way. It's the opposite, right? Because when we have conversations with people, we try and find things that bind us together, right? What do we have in common? Where can we agree on stuff? And what you're saying, I think, is reverse that natural tendency. And let's find the things we might in primeval times have fought over, because that's what's actually really important. So I love the cultural bit that brings, as well as I can see the value in the individual decisions that you're talking.
Yeah. But the other thing is that progress, at least in terms of certain scientific pursuit, has encouraged adversarial collaboration. And that's precisely what that is, right? So, I would work with someone who, and I have done with people who think very, very theoretically differently to me. I said that they're on quite fundamental levels, actually. But well, I hadn't thought about this in this way. When you start, trying to work with someone, you're right. Okay, well, there has to be some degree of common ground to be able to move the needle in a direction that's valuable or insightful or so on. But you have to kind of also do that in good faith. So you have to kind of seek out people who are genuinely also interested in doing the same. And also the other thing is even conversationally, right? I suspect this also reflects what goes on within the podcasting domain, which is, you want to kind of push back a little bit, because you aren't going to learn anything if you don't challenge. Now, the other person that's on the receiving end, again, in the kind of good faith, has to go, right, okay, well, let me assume that actually you're just kind of curious. You probably, maybe you don't agree, but I need to clarify what I mean for you to then respond to tell me why you disagree. And then somehow or other we coordinate that. Otherwise you'll go, yeah, I like that. You go, yeah, I like that too. All right, well, we both like that then. Isn't that great? It's like, well, what have we learned other than we both like the same thing? Like, we're not four, right? So it's okay if you're a 4-year-old doing that. This is actually even 4-year-olds don't this. Most of the time they're doing a whole load of other stuff. But anyway, you get the point, right? So we're doing that, but it's very difficult to do that professionally, because there's all of these other things that you're alluding to at the start, which is kind of reputation, or maybe your kind of defensive thinking to protect yourself in case things go wrong, and all of that stuff. So you need to be able to move those things. If you have someone that says, no, come on, let's do this now, Yeah, we do this and also in education as well, right? I think you want to be able to inspire critical thinking. You can't do that if you're only ever focusing on what minimizes the tension.
So I love this construct, and I think, I mean, this goes much broader than risk, right? So we can think about this in terms of other decisions that we're making, but it's a helpful gateway to think about it. But what you've promoted is closer to, I'm never going to suggest that we're going to get 100% honest discussion, particularly in corporate environments of this point, but we're getting closer to it. We're moving in the right direction with the structure you've talked about, and we've aired the difficult and challenging stuff. Talk a little bit about the prioritization piece off the back of it, because I can see that that leads to healthier conversations. We air things that we wouldn't otherwise air. How do we then think about prioritizing off the back of that?
Well, you need a very good chair for that discussion. But in a practical sense, you go, well, before we entered into the room, we had whether you use the tool, which case you've got something to kind of evidence, or you go with your gut or intuition, or whatever that is. You go, well, we've moved along because we've used this process to then decide, well, we aren't all going to agree on the three things that we actually as an organization need to respond to, but we still have to make a practical decision. So that's why we've gone with these three things. And we can justify that as a group because this is what we've discussed, right? So yes, we need to be aware of all of these tensions or these kind of issues that have been highlighted in this kind of discussion about the disagreements. We acknowledge that. And we might have to come back to that because these things are ongoing, right? So often in these kind of situations, you're making an initial prioritization, but you have to revisit that in the next quarter and the next year and so on. So you're actually, these things need to be recorded because we need to go back to those things. And also when we're having to make a rationalization or a justification for these things, you go, right, well, we knew this, but let's say it turns out there's massive disagreement on what the evidence base is for a particular risk. You go, well, we're not going to deal with that right now, but we recognize that that's an issue. So at some later stage, what we'll do is then review the evidence that is out there and then try to incorporate that. And in which case we might make an adjustment, right? So that's being fair. You're right. We simply have to make a decision. We can't take that into account. We're making it on different criteria, but we've acknowledged that that has created some tension because there's uncertainty around the evidence base. So we're going to have to do something about that later on, right? So all of that is fair, right? So you have to make a practical decision, right? So that risk management is all about that. But you're informed by and recognize where the tensions are to then do something practical about it. And if you actually explain that to people, yeah, people will give some kind of latitude to that. You're gonna go, right, okay, well, I get it. I may not be entirely happy about it because I think that's actually quite important, but I get it. You're gonna do something about it later, not now. Right, so that's solved in one sense. Right, so you can make again practical decision where you're right. Well, on the whole, given the weighting and all of the scoring that was done, generally we agree on this thing. We don't agree with these two things in terms of the ranks, but mostly we're going to go with this and then we'll come back to it later. Right. So that's again, a very basic way and practical way to solve that.
One of the things that struck me as you were talking was this idea of here's a logic and a rationale that we can all buy into, right? Because we've set the criteria before. And so we kind of know. And of course, that relies on us not having the meeting that you originally talked about, which is the one where everybody's neatly steered into coming to an answer that somebody wants. So it's a genuine discussion. But one of the things that struck me is that tension, fleshing out the bits where we disagree. That seems to me to be challenging. It's difficult, but I can see the value add in it. But what I find fascinating is when we think about collective responsibility, we see that governments and boards where people are then required to go out and own something where they don't necessarily agree with the decision. And we've seen people that are really good at it. There are people that are terrible at it, right? You can see that they're basically it's the equivalent of a hostage video, right? They're just not really enjoying this situation. They're having to go along with it. And I wondered whether that concept you can see why it theoretically makes sense to have people going out and fronting something they don't necessarily agree with. It's been agreed behind closed doors. But if you've brought the heat into the room, that could make that a little bit harder, right? If it goes against me in that thing. So I wondered whether you had any thoughts about whether that collective responsibility that we all know is a sham. Because actually, if these processes that you talk about have genuinely gone on, there's genuinely been a debate. Of course, there's going to be opposing views. And if we're making a lot of noise publicly to get the right culture and organization about, we want to challenge each other, is it helpful then to have a conclusion that says, well, everybody's agreed and everybody's happy? Or would it be more honest to actually say, well, no, you know what, we have got different views on this is what we're going to do and everybody's happy with it, but you don't have to pretend that you're 100% happy with it.
Yeah, this is where I think, the other area of work that it isn't necessarily played up, which matters is causality, right? So what's causing for finally making a determination around something which is unpalatable, because that's how, yeah, I experience that often. You're right. Okay, I'm having to go with something that actually, in some cases, it departs from what the evidence is saying, but it has a kind of practical value to it. You go, right, okay, we have to basically go with this. Right. And sometimes that happens personally. So, well, that's kind of unpalatable, but I get it. Now, why is causality important here? Because you go, well, what's the causal explanation behind that? Why is that? So it's unpalatable, but I'm having to go along with it for reasons of, right? So we can't do anything else other than this right now. There is a strong tension that is, we either have to appease a particular board or appease or the populace or whatever other stuff is part of it, an agenda of particular parties, but whatever, all of those things, broad and narrow levels. People are generally pretty savvy if you go out there and then try to hoodwink them and go, I totally find this unpalatable. I'm not going to tell everybody else that. And then try, like you said, the kind of hostage situation.
Right.
Maybe other people can see that. But there is a way that we could say, because if you try to steel man arguments as well, there's kind of straw manner and then steel man. So you go, well, what's the alternative of unpalatable position? I'll try and steel man that argument. Like, because if I'm going to have to try and convince people, I have to think about the reasons behind that, with some causal explanations behind that. Again, you don't have to be, you can present this also in a way that is humble. Right? So you show some humility. Right? But that's also a matter around the communication styles of people. Right? So it's not, all of this isn't absent from the way people present stuff to other people, all kinds of nuances in the way that their intonation, a whole load of other stuff, right? So to wrap that up as a point, the idea is, there are times where you have to reflect that not everybody agreed, but there were tension, but we actually came to this kind of thing as a solution for now. We have to say that in some way, but you go, right, everybody agreed. Well, you think, well, that's being disingenuous because there are a whole group of people in that room that knew that, right? So you can't keep, right. So there are ways of doing things in a slightly more honest manner and with some degree of humility that people will generally forgive. I said, that's the other thing. People can be forgiving as long as you're doing some things in earnest, right? So if you're not doing it in earnest, then but then what's the point? You might as well just, then you're kind of being slightly a bit of a dictator then. He would just tell people, just force people to do stuff. What's the point? Because the rest is a total charade.
Absolutely. No, the reason I raised it is I think if you're going to get these cultural benefits, it isn't just about what happens in the boardroom or the risk committee or whatever. We want this across the piece. We want people to have difficult conversations. And actually, rather than organizations, which they often do, is saying things like, we believe in challenge. right? And then you discover pretty quickly that the thing that's chiseled into the wall about challenge is yes, but don't actually do it. Just say yeses. So what you're doing is you live in the values a little bit. You're saying to people, this is really important. And hence we structure meetings in a way that is driving that behavior so that we can role model. You won't see it, but we're starting to role model and we talk about things in this way. And this is how we do things here. That's starting to build acceptance and processes that support the thing you say you want, right? So it's authentic and original. And so the reason I thought that was it's all very well saying, well, we believe in this stuff, but if people can't come into the room when those decisions are being made, you have to equip the people that have been in the room who are going to be the, don't like the phrase, but culture carriers and go out to, you have to give them a credible line. And so if they come out with a sort of North Korean, it has been agreed at the party, blah, 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 that doesn't support the idea that there was debate and discussion. It just sounds like BS. And so I think it's really interesting when you talk in those terms. I do think part of the challenge here isn't just the doing it in the meeting, but is actually how do you communicate and disseminate that to other people? And that's a second challenge. So the first challenge is actually, are you making decisions the right way? The second is, do you know how to communicate that? Because if you say, we did it in this way and we had a very robust discussion, you heard those lines. There was a very robust discussion around the table, right? And you just know it's not true. And it's almost sometimes it's said so that you know it's not true, right? There's a kind of a wink with it together. We had a very robust discussion, right? Everybody goes, bullshit, right? That was just decided by so and so. We all know that. That's the way it operates. So I do think there's something really interesting you're talking about here, is saying there's a communications thing. There's a not just living this thing, but we also have to learn how to talk about it. And that's not, unlike the way you talked about the meeting, which is a one size fits all, this communication thing absolutely isn't, because if you deliver in a way that's not authentic to you, people can smell that. And so I think there's a little bit of almost, we all need to work out, if you're sat around the table, there are 8 people around the table, maybe there's 8 different ways that message is being communicated to other people, to the people that they speak to. And so I think there's something interesting about thinking about not just what happens in the room and the structure, but also how is that disseminated? Because otherwise you're losing some of the value that you were talking about before.
Yes, because a lot of this is part of engendering trust. I want to contribute meaningfully to my organization. So then I only want to see that the things that I'm contributing or how I'm contributing is actually aligned with what the mission statement or the values are. And this is often something that you see is kind of, right, well, what are our values? Well, if you have to ask that, that's kind of, you ought to know that. And you ought, I mean, you'd think, right? So you ought to know that, but also that presumably if it's a value is going to be relatively consistent, right? Because if you have to keep changing your values multiple times over, then that's a problem,
right?
So so our values this time round,
today's
values are, it's like, well, they're not values then, are they? They're just kind of dynamic preferences, right? So there's not.
I'd love it if a company just went, we don't have values, we have dynamic preferences. Because that would be honest, right? There are organizations that we see out there that have exactly that.
Yeah, but the other thing is that they often employ externals to come in to tell them what the values ought to be. Okay, well, that probably doesn't look very good. But the thing is that has a net sort of effect in terms of the kinds of things that you're talking about, because culturally, we need to, as an organization, do things which maximizing the value of the people that work in it. And that means actually sometimes we're going to get loads of people that disagree, but they have to disagree in meaningful way, right? So the kind of extension in the kind of dysfunctional end is well, everybody knows that now there's a whole load of meetings that are set up where everybody disagrees all the time. So, well, I want to disagree. Right. Oh God, what have we done? Like, our value is disagreement. No. It has to be demonstrated in a meaningful way, which actually is tangible. You go, right, okay, well, there was a bit of disagreement. We could tell, actually. We can even make that transparent. There are minutes that reflect what the discussions were. We can show what the scoring was, any of that kind of stuff. There's reverberating effects of that, because you go, right, when it matters for certain things that will affect a number of people, it looks like that the way the coordination was done does recognize that. It couldn't do anything about it at that time, but there's a space for that to occur. And so that can have incidental benefits without you having to then go, well, our value is dissent. And then it goes, oh, well, do you see what I mean? Like you're not playing up to a value because you then assign a box to it and go, look, this is a thing. It's like we live by that. We're doing that and we're doing it in a meaningful way. And so other people can kind of sign up to that and see, right, okay, well, there's practical contributions that are made in that way. If we find out how we can, it's not even that you're deliberately trying to disagree. It's just you're recognizing that other people are going to think differently from you. It's like, but you need to find a way to meaningfully integrate that. If you don't, then the whole thing is just a waste of time as well. Right? So that's the point. That needs structuring. And there's evidence to help with that.
It struck me actually, the point you just made there is if you, let's imagine you said, well, we agree on most things. This is really helpful from a diversity perspective, right? Because if you start to say, let's work out where we disagree, and that doesn't happen that often on that many subjects, well, boom, you've got a diversity problem. So I love the fact what you're actually helping to do is to sit there and say, do we genuinely have cognitive diversity around this table? And if not, if we find that actually there's more stuff that we're agreeing on than disagreeing, well, that's a problem. And so actually, I think there's something really, there's almost a really helpful checkpoint to say, actually, do we need to do something about the diversity piece? Have we got the right people in the room? And so I like the fact that the structure is almost auditing that on an ongoing basis, right? If there's nothing, I mean, literally, if you took it to extremists and went, well, there's nothing to discuss because we always agree on stuff. Well, either what's the point in having the meeting, or probably more likely, you don't have the right diversity of voices in the room, and that's a problem. And so from a risk management perspective, I love the fact that you've turned the structure around into it's really easy to identify. If the number of things we agree on exceeds the number of things that we disagree on, that points towards, I would argue, not having sufficient, either you're talking about pointless things or there's not enough diversity in the room.
Yeah. Not that I now want to overcomplicate things just before this ends. But there might be bleeding obvious things where everybody going to get 100% kind of agreement on. It's like, this is the most painful thing that we have to deal with right now. And the people in the room all agree, right? So you go, well, there isn't enough diversity of thought, so we'd have to bring someone that's definitely going to disagree.
Yeah. It's not the BBC false equivalence thing where we're interviewing someone on climate change. Oh, we better have a climate change skeptic who knows nothing to have the opposite view. No, I agree with that. I was thinking more on a sort of ongoing basis, right, as opposed to one-off individual
I was
issue.
being sort of slightly facetious, but worth kind of clarifying that, because the complement to that is, well, what constitutes evidence for the between sort of views? If you go into kind of academic domain, then you think, well, you've got people in the room that all study mole rats, right? So I'm guessing there aren't that many people that actually do study. But well, I don't know. Maybe there are thousands and millions of them. Let's imagine that there aren't, exactly, for the sake of argument. And they will study a particular aspect of their behavior or something like that. Well, they might disagree, but the disagreement is on such minor technical things. You go, what? Do you need that? If it's of consequence for a particular thing that requires being solved that's so nuanced, then fair enough. But if you're talking about something in terms of that includes a number of species, then actually that's probably not helpful, right? So it has to be proportionate to the thing that you actually care about, that you think, right, what the range of expertise or different kind of opinions will be. But we can sort of do that. We can solve that problem. We do on a regular basis anyway. But it's kind of horses for courses, which is, the range of diversity of the expertise that you have has to be practically sampled for a particular problem that needs solving. Otherwise, then again, you're creating unnecessary kind of problems otherwise.
Love it. As ever with you, Magda, the time just flies, and I've got so many thoughts buzzing around in my head, but we should probably quit while we're ahead, or while we've still got questions hanging there, because that gives me the perfect excuse to have you back on the show at another time to continue these discussions and explore stuff if if you're up for that. This may be the first time people have heard of you, and I will put links to your previous appearances on the show in the show notes for people to find that. But if anybody wants to find out more, hasn't come across you yet, how can they find you and read more about what you're up to?
Just put my name in a search engine. I think you're likely to find, my homepage or, email and things like that. So people are interested or on LinkedIn, then contact me. I'm happy to help.
Brilliant. I will help that process by putting that link in the show notes as well. But as ever, thanks for being great fun, because it always is, always makes me smile. We always laugh about things, always go down rabbit holes, which is the whole point of these sorts of discussions. And I always learn a ton of stuff, as I'm sure my listeners would have done. So thank you as ever.
Thank you very much.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Magda for appearing again, and to you for listening. To find out more about Magda, her research, and to hear the episodes of the show that she appeared on before, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. If you like the show, do please leave a review for it on whichever platform you're listening to it. And also do get in touch with me with ideas, suggestions, and feedback. I love hearing from you. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Remember to prioritise your risks correctly. And thank you so much for listening.